Welcome everyone to today's session of The Editor's In. Today's episode is the value of reviewing, and we have another special guest that I will pass the virtual mic to here shortly to introduce himself, but wanted to welcome you to this today's edition, and we will post this on our website, of course, and provide more information about our guest. So with that, I would like to pass the mic over to our guest to introduce himself.
Thank you very much, Anthony. It's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate spending this time with you on this podcast, and I'm a fan. Thank you, and it's great to talk. So I'm Richard Delahunty. I'm Global Portfolio Director at Taylor & Francis, one of the big academic publishers. I'm responsible for about 400 journals across physical sciences, engineering, and really we spend our time working actively with editors, with peer reviewers, with authors, as well as training peer reviewers all around the world. So I hope we can have a chat about some of the experiences that we really see when looking at peer review across. I think I publish about 22,000 articles a year, and look forward to sharing some experience now.
Yes, absolutely. So you say with just a few articles then, huh?
A few, yeah.
Exactly. And of course, I am editor-in-chief of Marriage and Family Review, which is one of Taylor & Francis journals. So that is how I came into contact with Richard. So of course, our podcast follows a fairly similar format. We ask 5 questions. So let's go ahead and get started. These questions were provided to the guests. So let's start with your perspectives on the value of reviewing from the perspective of the scholar, of course, wanting to acknowledge that I, as an editor, and other editors certainly, have a motivation and interest in finding reviewers. But what are your thoughts on what is the value of reviewing for scholars?
So I think for the whole period of this podcast, I'm probably going to say the phrase many hats, because I hear it so often every day from an editor who may be on a tenure committee, who may be editing a journal, who may be an author, who may be guest editing a special issue. So there are, without a doubt, so many wonderful, unique things to being, to working with scholars. Peer review is, without a doubt, the most contested aspect of scholarly communication and one of the areas I work in. It's also conversely reported as a vital part of it. So I know this. How do I know this? Well, we regularly survey all our authors, as most people get surveyed in most situations now. But what we really want to do is to get their satisfaction scores with all sorts of things. So with the production process, with the peer review process too, and with the experience they have in the journal. And that's from all perspectives. So the richness to the feedback, the quality, the timeliness to the review, all those things. The one statistic I dug out that I thought would be useful for this question was a 2019 Sense About Science survey, especially on peer review. And the headline they reported was that 90% of researchers believe their last paper was improved through the peer review process. It's a good headline figure. And for an often contested system, challenged system, with many calls for more openness, more transparency, greater scrutiny, that is a very powerful number. So that's definitely the author's perspective. For journal editors, I think without a doubt there is distinct value. I'm sure you'll say the same, Anthony. They get very much a sense that there is value there, that the detailed expertise you're able to get from a peer reviewer when you find that right person, if you find that right person, is so beneficial. It's often hard to find that specialist expertise and often takes time, and people often report how time poor they are. And that will be familiar to anyone, I'm sure, listening to this podcast. But peer reviewers give a broader view. That's very important of the key debates, the history, the trajectory of a very small field. And that's, of course, we're in the business of publishing expertise, and micro interests are extremely important in academic publishing. Crucially, those peer reviews give that final endorsement that a work is sound. It's a checkbox, but it's a huge amount of authority behind that checkbox. And that's the basis for a final decision. And the decision is really everything when it comes to the editor. There's a sanctity in that moment, that moment of acceptance, and a huge celebration, a sigh of relief on the part of the author. And I would suggest my colleagues in publishing recognize that more, because I don't think we get the joy of that moment of getting published, and I know it's felt and experienced. So I think from the reviewer's perspective as well, I have to call out in this value question the reviewer's sense of value, because I often hear a lot of grumbles about the process, and yet, much like the researchers saying, when they publish, they value the review process. The reviewers value the early access to research. It's not that they can do all the reviews that requests that cross their desk, but time and again we get that message that there's a value in early access to research, that there's a privilege there to getting that early access to research, and it's a way, it's the first rung on the ladder for many of getting on an editorial board to getting at editorship on a journal. So I would suggest peer reviewing is the gateway to access a system that is often perceived as being closed. And if anyone's interested in what our key metric is on acceptances of invitations to peer review, that would be 29% of people invited to peer review actually producing a completed review. So many are called, but fewer choose to accept that call.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. There's a lot there to unpack.
Oh,
I would like to note, and hopefully you're okay with me saying this. I'm, of course, in the U.S. And you are in the U.K.
Yeah.
So when you say there are a contested process, is that something that you're saying is a global issue that you see across the Taylor and Francis journals, or is that contextualized in a particular area of the world?
I think the contested part of it is definitely global, and we see that largely in new forms of peer review. So there's a real embracing of different norms when it comes to peer review, to more open practices. Over the years, I've been to conferences in my field in scholarly communication where there have been some very important, impassioned voices saying this system is not fair. I contributed to the research. I don't get a credit. I felt invested, and so authorship and a stake in the research cycle is very much a hot topic in scholarly communication across all subjects, but with obviously a very different take on it in some cases. So all fields have their own course, but I would say it is definitely global. It is definitely an area where all the stakeholders I work with want to work harder. And that means trying out new forms of peer review, more standardized approaches to peer review, more recognition of problematic issues when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion in our journals, more fairness, and more transparency overall for the scholarly system, which enables people to see it as an open system rather than a closed one.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. In terms of, as a reviewer, you are inherently helping to shape the field. Yes, you get access to the cutting edge research in the papers, and you also get to help shape that by providing a review or helping to nudge the authors in a particular direction. But for many fields, that is you don't get credit for it, direct credit. I mean, we see new systems like is it Publons or Publons? I'm not sure if I'm saying it correctly, that,
Yeah.
will give you some credit. So that is probably something that the field, science itself, is going to have to figure out what is the best way to incentivize that process. I hadn't really thought about it in that sense. But yeah, that is, I can see why that would be, contested. Yeah, absolutely. So given that, what do you think are some ways that a given scholar's training impacts the extent to which they review for academic journals?
So I gave this some deep thought. I think I might be best placed to start by talking about how we guide our editors formally in selecting reviewers. I thought that might be a good place to start before I get into some examples of good and challenging practice when it comes to how the scholar's training impacts their reviewing. So our standard training is in selecting reviewers is about the goal being to achieve balanced feedback, to consider some basic questions. Are the reviewers you're looking at representative of the field? Is the content of the article controversial? Is it contested itself? And have you selected the right people? What's the impact on the community? What would the, I don't know if this is a local term, but what would the sniff test be? The public scrutiny test, if actually there was openness attached to it. So that's an interesting thing. And obviously selection bias is something you want to avoid. It's one of the big areas in peer review that needs to be tackled and is being tackled to some extent in some quarters. You want to encourage a diverse pool of reviewers for sure, but there are those moments where you are so time poor and good enough might be hovering in the background. So that's why the training gives you new muscle memory, something to rely on as a guide. And some of the great positive effects of training, whether that's in a department, whether that's delivered at a journal level, actually through on-the-job work, or whether it's delivered through one of the training programs. And other publishers are available, but Taylor and Francis do, of course, offer training all around the world. And that is a two-way process. So it's about giving best practice and sharing our experience, but it's also listening to good experience. And the training we offer is absolutely dynamically updated based on all the good practice we see around the world. So in terms of the positive effects of training and the departmental setting, when we see a review has taken time and courtesy and use courtesy to constructively critique, that gives real value, and that does impact the extent to which you see reviews. Also, I think this is really key. It sounds like a soft point, but it's actually really key, where a reviewer has been able to properly empathize and reviewed respectfully. I mean, when we give training courses, we give comments, anonymized good comments and bad comments. So you can really see where there's been a respectful, empathetic review process where someone's thought about their comments and thought, well, let me carefully word this to see how it lands. Nonetheless, critical and constructive, but actually working as if you understand the author's experience. So challenges, I would say, where academic labor is unrecognized, unrewarded, is just accepted as part of a scholar's setting and to fall under their responsibility, and where service is not really part of that training. And I see in areas of good practice the concept of service to each other being very central to peer reviewing. And also where in some settings the training's uneven, inconsistent, and where it is on the job but not particularly positive on the job. And the part of that is where you can see unconscious bias training has not been a tool in the research training, but when you see and recognize that training on recognizing those unconscious biases has been delivered, that is a valuable tool in all cases, and we see that very clearly.
Yeah, absolutely. And the previous conversations in this series have really focused on a scholar's relationship with a given mentor and how he, she, or they, scaffold that scholar through that process. But in this case, you're talking about, what things the publisher provides to help, scholars become better reviewers or good reviewers. In fact, just today, someone that owes me a review, well, owes the journal a review, I should say, they reached out to say, hey, I'm about to start. Are there any resources? And of course, Taylor and Francis provides editor resources to us. And I just linked that page to this scholar, and they immediately responded and said, oh, thank you, this is very helpful. And so that I could make an assumption that that particular scholar didn't have, a journal editor as a mentor like I did, that, provided me a pretty clear framework for how to review a paper. So it can create these sort of biases. I don't know if biases, maybe inequalities in skill set, opportunity, and so forth. And in terms of, how a scholar learns to be a good reviewer. But it is good that many publishers are, providing such training to help, the professional development.
Right. And the thing is about that scaffold that you're talking about is that, and the mentoring is that it's great. It creates good practice and it perpetuates good practice. It also means that what we find on journals is that good reviewers tend to get the reward, inverted commas, of doing more reviews. And those I don't know if you do this, but when you look down a list of the editorial board members and of the reviewers and look at the number of reviews annually, it's a little bit lumpy. You see some big numbers against some people, but that tells a story about time commitments and pressures on everyone's time, and particularly in 2020, as something we're very mindful of, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And just the fact that, you want to get the strongest review for a paper, because hopefully people keep in mind that the goal is to strengthen a paper that may ultimately be published in your journal. And so me as an editor, I have on one hand the pool of, let me get the strongest reviewers, and that may be a small pool, but also trying to be cognizant of DEI issues and giving opportunities, and making sure that I provide that by also giving opportunities for those who have not had good reviews in the past, or have not had the experience in reviewing. And that's a delicate balance that, we're all judged as editors, and that may determine if we get an invite to continue on in the future as an editor. And so it's a unique thing that you have to sort of balance, that balancing act, right?
Yeah. And they're your
And,
colleagues, they're your friends in some cases on the board and in your
absolutely
community. So there are knock-on effects, I imagine.
There are several levers to try to move and keep on balance. So, are there other barriers to becoming reviewers based on issues of diversity that you've seen on your end?
So again, I've given this great thought, and it won't surprise you to hear that, of course, there are barriers, but that's not to say that as a publisher working actively with 400 journals, the absolute goal is to remove those barriers, actual and perceived. So this has really got us to the point where we have done and need to continue to do a very real shift in what we're doing towards equity in the scholarly publishing system. It is not enough for us to pay lip service to it, and I think what we need to do and what we are doing is to recognize the inequities in the system. So as publishers, editors, board members, and existing reviewers, extending the hand, supporting more voices in publishing. So this means, it means multiple things actually. It means at board meetings, we're not plowing through data. We are taking moments and we are prioritizing, putting early in our meetings that discussion about the editorial board. That moment is crucial for reviewing issues of diversity, thinking about actions that we can take. I know areas of great practice where we do that, where we break out, where we discuss actively how we, in all forms, we generate more ideas for more boards, to have regularized terms on those boards as well, and everyone recognizing that actually a term for life is not healthy. Maximums and minimums on boards are not healthy either. And there should be no limit, perceived limit, and there should be visible diversity on those boards. It also means transparency around editor recruitment too, and we and other publishers and other stakeholders need to work harder. I am definitely minded to make sure that whenever I'm giving outreach, whenever I'm giving advice to colleagues on recruitment practices, I'm pointing towards our best practice, which is openness, transparency, making sure when you're writing an advert that actually you're aware of your own biases and that other people are reviewing that advert, that the venues that an advert for a new editor goes to, that they're in all the right places. They're in a range of places, and those venues are super important, that you're not just choosing one or two select venues, which in itself is selection bias. There is such an insider outsider notion as well with the scholarly publishing system, and I think the ambition is to really break down those walls, and part of that is creating those processes that are transparent and open, but also giving opportunity. And I think that's we're about revolution as much as evolution.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good actual segue into the next question about giving younger scholars an opportunity to review when, multiple chances or how. And a part of why I asked this is recently another journal reached out to me to review a paper, and I actually didn't have time, but I reached back out to the editor and said, hey, I'm willing to review this if you would allow me to review it with one of my doctoral students. And initially, I'm pretty sure it was the editorial assistant that responded and said, that's fine. But then the editor came back and said, actually, we have a rule against allowing anyone without a PhD to review. And I still reviewed it. We were able to fix that on my students' Vita so that, they can get some credit for it. But it just made me sort of think even more about if that's the practice of that journal, then it may be a little late by the time that student crosses over to the work world, because they need that sort of experience on their CV to even get their foot in the door. But also on the other hand, I want to make sure I'm respectful to the journal and understanding that they have to think about the skill level of individuals that are reviewing the papers. So it's a balancing act. And can you provide some thoughts on best practices in this area?
Yeah, I think I love that example. I think it's really powerful, and I may well give that example to others. And I think that's that kind of mentoring part of reviewing is such good practice. So I would absolutely endorse that, and I think that's wonderful. The other thing I would say, in the mentoring space, I do see wonderful areas of work, and I at this point as well should really shout out the Learned Society sector for their work in supporting and embracing early career scholars. It's so important, the work that learned societies do, and those professional institutes and organizations to support their memberships, which include early career scholars, and forums that really form the base of training for many in many subject areas. And I publish on behalf of those. We see those around the world, and they work very actively to support scholars. So that's really the major thing I wanted to say about that. But the other thing is activity at journal level. So I see early career editors springing up all over the place. So and I am just appointing a new associate editor on one of my bigger journals who's absolutely wonderful, and this is going to be the first associate editor on the journal, and it's a real pathway. And that's someone who was interviewed for the main editor job. There wasn't an opening for an associate editor, but was so good. She's early career, and it's one example where I think you can create opportunity if you have an open process. So I think early career posts are an excellent area to bring new scholars into journals, to make sure that editorship is constantly refreshed. And backing that up, early career editorial board members, I'm starting to see much more as well. And I think the role of a board member is very different on some journals. So in some cases, it's a steering committee, a governance board, where it may not be appropriate and may not be desired. But in almost all cases that I see, mentoring by way of an early career board membership really helps, and it sends that signal, something material, that you are open for business and that you're an open journal, and that you want to demystify the publishing process. That is really what we're all about. We're about inclusivity and welcoming people into a network, because after all, journals are little networks, and they should embrace the sense of community. And being closed is not the right thing when it comes to growing a community and that community feeling.
Yeah, absolutely. And those provide multiple pathways for ushering in the next generation of scholars, whether it's through the mentoring process with a reviewer, or you can have them as an associate editor or on a board, or, one editor, I believe, talked about having a junior editor board, just to learn about the process. And all of those are key points to helping to build the skill over time. So yeah, thanks for that. Well, we've actually covered our 5 questions. It goes quickly. Yes, we have.
It does.
So I wanted to offer you the opportunity for any last thoughts to offer to our community.
I just wanted to say a big thank you to you, and a big thank you to anyone listening. The thing about podcasts is I've been talking to a lot of editors over the past week, and I think one of them was talking about that third place and podcasts taking people to that third place, and I am definitely transported to a third place when I hear a podcast. So I hope we are doing this and have been doing this for the past half hour, that we give peace and enrichment to people listening. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your insights and helping us to articulate and communicate to our community the value of reviewing. And to our audience, thank you for joining us and listening in. Of course, you've been listening to the Editors in podcast with our special guest, Richard Delahunty, and of course, yours truly, Dr. Anthony James. Today, podcast will be available on our website, where you will find a short bio on our guest and a link to his journal website. So with that, we want to say thank you again and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.